to Congressman Chris Smith. Mr. Speaker, years ago when I came to Washington the very first time, it was on a weekend, and I couldn't come here and visit the Congress, but I came to the congressional halls of where their offices were. And there were two offices that I visited. One was the late Henry Hyde, one of the greatest human beings to ever sit in this place. And the other was to Chris Smith. And I just have to say to you, I know it embarrasses him terribly, but this is my heart. I believe this man to be truly one of the greatest heroes in this Congress. All the 30-plus years that he's been here, he has given everything he had to protect little children that couldn't vote for him. And I'm just convinced in the councils of eternity that someone's going to look him in the eyes one day when he crosses over that threshold and say, well done. And I'm just grateful that we have men like that here. Mr. Speaker, Daniel Webster once said, hold on, my friends, to the Constitution and to the republic for which it stands. For miracles do not cluster. And America is a miracle, Mr. Speaker. For miracles do not cluster. And what has happened once in 6,000 years may never happen again. So hold on to the Constitution. For if the American Constitution should fall, there will be anarchy throughout the world. Our founding fathers wrote the words of our Constitution down for us because they didn't want us to forget their true meaning or to otherwise fall prey to those who would deliberately undermine or destroy it. This has always been the preeminent reason why we write down documents or agreements or declarations or constitutions in the first place, to preserve their original meaning and intent. Mr. Speaker, it really causes us to ask ourselves the question, why was all of this effort made? Why are we really here in this chamber? And I would suggest to you that if we simply avail of ourselves of the most cursory glance at the Founding Fathers, we are all here to protect the lives of Americans and their constitutional rights. And protecting the lives of Americans and their constitutional rights is the reason Congress exists in the first place. The phrases in the 5th and 14th Amendments encapsulate our entire Constitution when they proclaim that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It's that simple. Those words are a crystal clear reflection of our Constitution and the proclamation that the Declaration of Independence put forward to all of us when it declared that all men, and I would suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, that's all little babies too, are created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, those being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those words are the essence of America, and our commitment to them for more than 2 centuries has set America apart as the flagship of human freedom in the world. It has made us the unipolar superpower of this planet, and yet unspeakable suffering and tragedy have occurred whenever we have strayed from those foundational words. Our own United States Supreme Court did exactly that, Mr. Speaker, when they ruled that millions of men, women, and children were not persons under the Constitution because their skin was the wrong color. It took a horrible civil war and the deaths of over 600,000 Americans to reverse that unspeakable tragedy. And we saw that same arrogance in 1973 when the Supreme Court said the unborn child was not a person under the Constitution. And we have since witnessed the silent deaths of now over 55 million innocent little boys and baby girls who died without the protection of the Constitution, the protection that the Constitution gave them, and without the protection this Congress should have had the courage to defend. Mr. Speaker, the recent trial of Kermit Gosnell has played an instrumental role in exposing late-term abortions for what they really are, relocated infanticide. Kermit Gosnell is this now famous late-term abortionist convicted of murder, in part for using scissors to cut the spinal cords of numerous little babies who had survived abortion attempts. One of his employees said that in one case that there was this little baby that had been so damaged by the process that it no longer had eyes or a mouth, but she could hear him screeching and making this sound like a little alien. Now, I know sometimes, Mr. Speaker, we deliberately try to hide those things from our minds. I know I do. But once in a while it's important just to think on the life of this one little child that was only in this world outside the womb for a few minutes and found nothing but horror and suffering, not knowing why, not knowing what the purpose or the reason was, and no one was there. And I just have to say to you, Mr. Speaker, if that isn't wrong, then we can absolve ourselves forever because nothing is wrong. Had Kermit Gosnell done the same thing mere moments before, when that little baby was still inside the womb, in many states in this Union, in the land of the free and the home of the brave, it would have been entirely legal. Now, we've seen similarly other late-term abortionists across this country exposed for such incomprehensibly barbaric practices. Leroy Carhart in Maryland compared a baby in the womb before an abortion to meat in a crock pot. Abortion clinic employees in Arizona explained to a woman seeking an abortion at 24 weeks that, quote, they are sometimes alive, yeah, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the baby will come out whole. Douglas Carpin in Texas has been accused of by 4 separate employees, of killing 3 to 4 born-alive babies per day by either cutting their spinal cords, forcing instruments in their soft spots on their heads, or twisting their heads off, completely off of their necks, with his bare hands. Very simply, Mr. Speaker, the public is beginning to learn that there are scores of other Kermit Gosnells out there. He was not an aberration. You know, one of the saddest things that we must not miss here is that as evil as this man was, and the horrible things that he did, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, they are not uncommon in America. And because of this, Americans are beginning to realize that somehow we are bigger than abortion on demand, and that 55 million dead children are enough. We are beginning to ask the real question: does abortion take the life of a child? And, Mr. Speaker, that is the question that I would put before all of my colleagues and anyone in the sound of my voice to ask themselves in their heart, put aside the rationalization just for a moment, and ask yourself, does abortion really take the life of a child? If it does not, I'm willing to walk out of here and never mention the subject again. But if abortion really does kill a little baby, if it really does, then those of us sitting here in the seat of freedom, in the greatest and most powerful nation in the history of humanity, also find ourselves standing in the midst of the greatest human genocide in the history of the world. And throughout America's history, the hearts of the American people have always been moved with compassion when they discover a theretofore hidden class of victims. Once the humanity of the victim and the inhumanity of what is being done to them finally becomes clear in their minds, America changes their heart. And I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, America is on the cusp of another such realization. And I fear if we fail to respond this time, because after this, after Kermit Gosnell, no excuse remains. We have seen the worst, and if we do not respond, then we will slide into that Sumerian darkness where the light of human compassion has gone out and where the survival of the fittest has prevailed over humanity, and it must not happen on our watch in this generation. Medical science regarding the development of unborn babies and their capacities at various stages of growth have advanced dramatically, and it incontrovertibly demonstrates that unborn children clearly do experience pain. The single greatest hurdle to legislation like H.R. 3803 has always been that opponents deny unborn babies feel pain at all, as if somehow the ability to feel pain magically develops instantaneously as a child passes through the birth canal. And Mr. Speaker, this level of deliberate ignorance might have found excuse in earlier eras of human history, but the evidence available to us today is extensive and irrefutable. Unborn children have the capacity to experience pain at least by 20 weeks, and as Congressman Smith said, very likely substantially earlier. The information, Mr. Speaker, is at www.doctorsonfetalpain.org. That's www.doctorsonfetalpain.org. And I would sincerely recommend to anyone in this chamber that is interested to really know the truth to go there and find out for themselves, rather than to have their understanding cemented in some earlier time when scientists still believed in spontaneous generation and that the earth was flat. That is the invincible ignorance sometimes that we find ourselves trying to break through on this seminal civil rights issue of our time. Most Americans think that late-term abortions are rare, but in fact there are approximately 120,000 late-term abortions in America every year, or that's more than 325 late-term abortions every day in America. And Mr. Speaker, I believe we're better than that. We're better than 325 late-term abortions every day in this country. I believe that we're better than dismembering babies who can feel pain at every agonizing moment. And I sincerely hope that we can, at the very least, come together to agree that we can draw a line in the sand at that point. That we can agree that knowingly subjecting our innocent unborn children to dismemberment in the womb, particularly when they've developed to the point when they can feel excruciating pain every terrible moment leading up to their undeserved deaths, it belies everything America was called to be. This is not who we are. Mr. Speaker, what we're doing to babies is real. It is barbaric in the pure sense of the word. It is the greatest human rights violation occurring on U.S. soil, and it has already victimized millions of pain-capable babies since the Supreme Court gave us all abortion on demand that tragic day in 1973. Mr. Speaker, Thomas Jefferson said that the care of human life and its happiness, and not its destruction, is the chief and only object of good government. And ladies and gentlemen, using taxpayer dollars to fund the killing of innocent unborn children does not liberate their mothers. It leaves their mothers oftentimes with the brokenness and the emotional consequences without anyone there to really recognize what they have dealt with. It is not the cause for which those lying out under the white stones at Arlington National Cemetery died. And Mr. Speaker, it is not good government. Abraham Lincoln called upon all of us to remember America's founding fathers and said, quote, their enlightened belief that nothing stamped with the divine image and likeness was sent into this world to be trodden on or degraded or imbruted by its fellows. He reminded those he called posterity, those, us, that when in the distant future some man, some faction, some interest should set up a doctrine that some were not entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that their posterity, that is us, ladies and gentlemen, their posterity might look up again to the Declaration of Independence and take courage to renew the battle which their fathers began. Mr. Speaker, may that be the commitment to all of us today, and I would yield to the gentleman, Mr. Stutzman, and I would thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank the gentleman from Arizona, and as well as thank the gentleman from New Jersey for their passion and also for them sharing with us today on such an important issue that faces us as a country. It's a privilege and an honor to stand here with Mr. Smith and Mr. Franks and thank you for your work, for all you've done for so long on an issue that is close to my heart and close to many people across the country's hearts as well. To see the picture here that Mr. Smith showed, if that doesn't touch a part of you, I don't know what will. And so thank you for the information and for the heart that you show for these little ones that are blessed with life until it's ended in such a brutal way. Mr. Speaker, the horrific case of Kermit Gosnell stripped away the abortion clinics, the abortion industry's euphemisms, and showed that abortion isn't safe and it isn't rare. Gosnell murdered newborn babies. He preyed on vulnerable women, and he stuffed bodies into freezers, trash bags, and cat food tins. While a jury has handed down their verdict for Kermit Gosnell, we as American people must render our verdict on abortion. Americans must take a hard look at abortion's grim reality. Gosnell's clinic, the court case, and the verdict for Kermit Gosnell brought us as Americans face to face with the brutality of abortion. We cannot turn our backs on it now. It is time for an open and honest discussion about abortion in this country. Kermit Gosnell's crimes shocked civilized people everywhere. The inescapable truth is that there is no moral distinction between ending a child's life 5 seconds after birth or 5 weeks before. Sadly, across this country, abortion providers like Planned Parenthood routinely perform brutal late-term abortions on unborn children who are able to feel pain. The end result at a Planned Parenthood clinic is the same result that occurred at Kermit Gosnell's clinic, and that is death. So I'm proud to stand here today to co-sponsor Mr. Frank's legislation to prohibit gruesome abortions of unborn children who can feel pain. And I thank the gentleman from Arizona for his consistent and strong support of the measure, and to a larger extent, his support for the unborn children, as we've seen today, as he spoke so eloquently from the floor. Today, I'm proud to join my colleagues, Mr. Smith, Mr. Harris, and others who have stood up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And I'm confident that we will expose big abortion's lies and restore a lasting respect for innocent life. With that, I'll yield back to the gentleman.
I thank you, Mr. Stutzman, for your eloquent remarks, as well as those of Chairman Franks, who was compassionate, courageous, and like you, and like our next speaker, eloquent in the defense of the most defenseless. And I would like to yield to Dr. Andy Harris, who is a board-certified anesthesiologist at Johns Hopkins University, hospital, I should say, a medical center, and yield him whatever time he would like.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from New Jersey for organizing this, because, you know, we come to Washington to make tough decisions. That's what the country expects of us. And, Mr. Speaker, I will offer the fact that one of the most difficult decisions we have to come to grips with is, when do we begin to protect human life? The gentleman from Arizona was absolutely right. We have to answer the question, does abortion take the life of a human child? And if we all agree that it does, then we have to ask ourselves and come to an agreement on, at what point do we begin to protect that life? At what point are we as a nation going to say that human life is worthy of protection? Now, as a physician, Mr. Speaker, I will tell you I'm always puzzled by the question, because scientifically, everyone who's taken a genetics course knows that from the moment of conception, it is a unique human life. The one-cell embryo is a unique human life, different from every other one in the world ever. Every cell in each and every one of our bodies has the exact DNA that we had when we were one cell big. The only difference is the number of cells we had. And one would argue, certainly, as the illustration here shows, this is not a one-celled fetus or baby. It's a human being that, given time, will grow to be your size or my size. I'm 6'4". I'm a little bigger than normal. Some people are shorter than average. But we're all human beings, so size doesn't make the difference. So again, from a scientific point of view, to me it's clear it should be, it is a human life from conception and should be protected. But, Mr. Speaker, I understand the country doesn't agree. Some people don't agree it should be protected. And so the question is, at what point do you protect it? Well, a lot of people would say at this point it probably is worth protecting that human life. Certainly the jury in Pennsylvania said that you can't kill that baby right after it was born. Strangely enough, federal law, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, says that it can be legal to kill that child 5 minutes before that birth. I think most Americans find that repulsive, that a baby at almost 9 months gestation, in many states, it's legal to kill that child 5 minutes before birth, but in Pennsylvania resulted in 3 murder sentences because it was 5 minutes after birth. So, Mr. Speaker, what this bill does is says, let's come together and let's agree on a time when human life is going to be protected. It's not going to be a perfect agreement. It's going to be arbitrary because, again, that human life started when it was 1 cell large. At conception, that human life started. We all agree that, Mr. Speaker, you and I are human life worthy of protection, so the only question is where we draw the line. And again, the gentleman from Arizona suggested correctly, we need to draw that line. This bill attempts to draw the line. The Supreme Court attempted to draw it, very clumsy drawing of the line, in the Roe v. Wade decision, because it said its viability. But the problem is viability, over the 30 years, plus years I practiced medicine, has changed. It's a moving target. Viability then was 25 weeks, now it's 23 and a quarter. It's a moving line. And what does viability mean? Viability means it can survive without the support of that mother. Well, that's a little arbitrary, Mr. Speaker, because, you know, if that mother had an elderly mother or grandmother at home, perhaps disabled with Alzheimer's disease, totally dependent on that mother. Now, it's not their mother, but it's the mother of a child, a fetus. That grown-up could be totally dependent on that other human being, that other human adult, and yet that human adult doesn't have the option of saying, well, since that individual is dependent upon me, I can make a life-and-death decision for that individual. No, that would be wrong. We'd all say that's wrong. So we're going to have to draw the line somewhere. And this bill says, let's do it when we believe that baby begins to feel pain. That, in fact, a D&E procedure will be exceedingly painful because, Mr. Speaker, this is exactly what happens in a D&E procedure. The fetus, the baby, is literally torn apart. Literally. This is what happens with it. So we're all going to have to agree, first of all, this is probably not very certainly not pleasant to look at. The medical books medical illustrations when I was studying, of course, which was around the time of Roe v. Wade, didn't have this kind of illustration, but abortion policy in this country in the past 30 years forces us to actually illustrate what it looks like. This is it. So this bill says, again, in the context of the Gosnell trial, showing all America that, and I think almost all America agrees, what happened in Pennsylvania, knowingly killing by snipping the spinal cord of an alive, awake baby right after an abortion procedure that resulted in a live birth, is in fact murder. It's the taking of a human life subject to punishment. But most people would say, well, but how are we going to protect this child? And I offer that this is a compromise maybe we all can work around and say, you know what, if that child during that procedure feels pain, then it probably should be protected under our law. Now the question is, again, it's not clear-cut. There'll be some disagreement among people when that pain can be felt. There's a lot of indication scientifically and chemically and with neurodevelopment that that child feels pain at 20 weeks. It's certainly a little more subject to discussion whether it's earlier. I will tell you later shouldn't be subject to discussion because, Mr. Speaker, you know that if you do a procedure on a premature infant born and brought to the neonatal intensive care unit, you actually administer pain relievers when you do the procedure. So the medical community has already decided that by 23 weeks you've already feels pain, and believe me, Mr. Speaker, it didn't magically occur with birth, the ability to feel pain. And again, we can know by the development of the nervous system, by things we can see and measure, we believe that at 20 weeks, that fetus, that baby can feel pain, and therefore deserves protection. Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that's a compromise we all ought to be able to work with. It's not, again, it's not, it is a compromise. Because, Mr. Speaker, I will tell you that human life does begin at conception. And again, the discussion here is not going to be when human life begins. It's when should this body, this Congress, this government protect the most innocent of human life. I'm going to agree. I think it's very reasonable to say when this fetus, this baby, can feel the pain of that procedure, it ought to be protected. In some way. Is this the perfect way? Maybe not. But we ought to begin that discussion. Because right now, Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court's interpretation of the law allows a state to allow an abortion that kills a baby right up to the moment of birth. And that's just not right. We need to set some line in law. And again, I'll agree with the gentleman from Arizona. It may not be a perfect line, but we all have to agree we need to draw it, to begin thinking about it. And I would suggest this is a reasonable one. When are we no longer going to subject that baby to the pain of a procedure and begin to protect that baby's life? So I want to thank the gentleman from New Jersey again. He's brought the issue before this body because, you know, if we believe that this is just some abstract thought about when we protect human life, as I've spoken about on the floor and the gentleman from New Jersey has, and Mr. Speaker, I suggest if you want some very interesting reading tonight, go home and Google the Journal of Medical Ethics and look for the article published last November where academics from Australia and Italy write an article suggesting that it should be all right to kill a human baby up to some certain amount of time after birth if that human baby is inconvenient to the family, to the mother and the family to which it belongs. Well, I would offer, Mr. Speaker, I hope that never happens in this country, that suggestion never takes root here. I think we'd find that horrendous. But it does bring up the question, if we find it so horrendous 1 minute after birth, shouldn't it be horrendous 1 minute before birth? And if it's 1 minute before birth, how about 1 week? How about 1 month? How about 2 months? We can go all the way back. Should it be when the heartbeat appears? It's 7 weeks, 7 weeks gestation. Heartbeat appears. Even earlier. Should it be when the baby moves? When quickening is felt? That's the medical term for it. It's quickening. This bill sets a reasonable point of discussion. Let's do it when we think a baby would feel the pain of that abortion. And with that, I'm going to yield back my time to the gentleman from New Jersey.
I want to thank my good friend and very distinguished colleague, Dr. Andy Harris, for his very eloquent and very incisive remarks, and for his leadership on behalf of human rights in general and including here in the United States. You know, we've been discussing human rights abuse here in the United States and trying to defend at least pain-capable unborn children from the violence of abortion. I'd like to focus for a few moments on human rights abuse that's occurring halfway around the world in China. Tomorrow, President Obama will meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping in California to discuss security and economic issues. A robust discussion on human rights abuses in China, however, must be on the agenda and not in a superfluous or superficial way. It is time to get serious about China's flagrant abuse of human rights. It's time for this president, this administration, to end its manifest indifference towards human rights abuse in the People's Republic of China. It's time for President Obama to cease his numbing indifference towards the victims of Beijing's abuse. Mr. Speaker, can a government, no read that, can a dictatorship that crushes the rights and freedoms of its own people be trusted on trade and security? China today is the torture capital of the world, and victims include religious believers, ethnic minorities, human rights offenders like Chen Guangzhen and Gao Zhejiang, and hundreds and thousands of political dissidents. If you are a political or religious dissident or believer, underground Christian church, Falun Gong, a part of the Uyghur Muslim ethnic minority, or a Tibetan, Buddhist, if you are arrested, you will be tortured, and in some cases you will be tortured to death. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, hundreds of millions of women have been forced to abort their precious babies pursuant to China's draconian one-child policy, which has led to gendercide, the violent extermination of unborn baby girls simply because they are girls. The slaughter of the girl child in China is not only a massive gender crime, but a security issue as well. A witness at one of my hearings, and I do chair the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations. And over the years, I've chaired over 46 congressional hearings focused exclusively on China's human rights issues. One of the witnesses at one of my earlier hearings, Valerie Hudson, author of a book called Bare Branches, testified that gender imbalance will lead inevitably to instability and chaos and even to war because of the domestic chaos and instability that will occur. And that the one child, and this is a quote from her, has not enhanced China's security, but it has demonstrably weakened it. Nicholas Eberstadt, the world-renowned AEI demographer, has famously phrased it and asked the question, what are the consequences for a society that has chosen to become simultaneously more gray and more male? The missing daughters by the tens of millions in China as a direct result of sex selection abortion. In 2000, Mr. Speaker, I authored a law that is known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. It is our landmark law in combating the hideous crime of modern-day slavery, sex and labor trafficking. China has now become the magnet for the traffickers, buying and selling women as commodities, selling them in China, against their will, of course, through coercion, because of the missing girls, the missing daughters, and the missing young women. Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, the world remembered the dream that was and is the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989, and deeply honors the sacrifice endured by an extraordinarily brave group of pro-democracy Chinese women and men who dared to demand fundamental human rights for all Chinese. 24 weeks ago this week, the world watched in awe and wonder, as it had since mid-April of 1989, as hundreds of thousands of mostly young people peacefully petitioned the Chinese government to reform and to democratize. China seemed to be the next impending triumph for freedom and democracy, especially after the collapse of the dictatorships in the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations. But when the People's Liberation Army poured in and around the square on June 3rd, the wonder of Tiananmen turned to shock, tears, fear, and helplessness. On June 3rd and 4th, and for days, weeks, and years, right up until today, the Chinese dictatorship delivered a barbaric response: mass murder, torture, incarceration, the systematic suppression of fundamental human rights, and cover-up. The Chinese government not only continues to inflict unspeakable pain and suffering on its own people, but the cover-up of the Tiananmen Square massacre is without precedent in modern history. Even though journalists and live television and radio documented the massacre, the Chinese Communist Party line continues to deny it, that it even occurred, to obfuscate and to threaten anyone who dares speaks out in China about the massacre and all the terrible barbarity that followed. In December of 1996, Mr. Speaker, General Chu Hatian, the operational commander who ordered the murder of the Tiananmen protesters, visited Washington, D.C. as the Chinese defense minister. You see, he was promoted after he killed all of those innocent people. Minister Chu was welcomed by President Clinton at the White House with full military honors, including a 19-gun salute, a bizarre spectacle that I and many others on both sides of the aisle protested. But why do I bring this up now? Minister Chu addressed the Army War College on that trip, and in answer to a question said, and I quote him, "Not a single person lost his life in Tiananmen Square," close quote, and claimed that the People's Liberation Army did nothing more violent than pushing people during the 1989 protests. Not a single person lost his or her life? Are you kidding? That big lie and countless others like it, however, is, and it was then, the Communist Party's line about Tiananmen. As chair of the Foreign Affairs Human Rights Committee then, I put together a congressional hearing within 2 days, December 8, 1996, and witnesses who were there on Tiananmen Square in 1989, including Dr. Yang Zhili, a leader and survivor of the massacre, and Time magazine bureau chief David Aikman, who were actually witnesses at my hearing this past Monday. We also invited Minister Chu, or anyone the Chinese embassy might want to send to the hearing to give an accounting of that blatant lie. I guess Minister Chu thought he was back in Beijing when he was at the Army War College, where the big lie is king and no one ever dares to do a fact check. Last week, Mr. Speaker, the U.S. Department of State asked the Chinese government to, quote, end harassment of those who participated in the protest of 1989 and fully account for those killed, detained, or missing. What was the response from the Chinese government? The Chinese Foreign Ministry, acrimoniously said that the United States should, quote, stop interfering in China's internal affairs so as not to sabotage Chinese-U.S. relations. We have heard that line from the Soviet Union. We heard it from those who supported apartheid in South Africa. Don't interfere. Human rights are universal, and we need to speak out boldly and without fear when they are violated, wherever and whenever they occur. Sabotage Sino-American relations because our side requests an end to harassment and an accounting. Sounds to me like they have much to hide. Therefore, Mr. President, tomorrow, when you meet with the unelected president of China, and Saturday when you meet with him as well, please be informed, be bold, be tenacious, and seriously raise human rights with Chinese President Xi. No superficial interventions, no checking off on the box, yeah, I raised human rights. Raise real names. Ask for their release. Raise real issues, like the horrific one-child per couple policy or the endemic use of torture by the Chinese dictatorship. Raise the 16 cases that are being raised and given to you to raise of individuals, people who in China are like the modern-day Nathan Sharansky's or others who have suffered so much for freedom for all these years, like Gao Zhejiang and others. Mr. Speaker, we will not forget what took place in Tiananmen Square 24 years ago this past Monday and Tuesday. The struggle for freedom in China continues. Someday the people of China will enjoy all of their God-given fundamental human rights. And as a nation of free Chinese women and men, they will someday honor and applaud all those who suffered so much in the Laogai, the Chinese gulags, and sacrificed so much for so long. Mr. President, the ball is in your court, President Obama. Raise these issues and do it in a robust, sincere, yes, diplomatic, but very powerful way. I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman yields back. Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Speaker asks to address the body for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I stand here today greatly saddened and disappointed in this House of Representatives. I was prepared to vote in support of the Homeland Appropriations Bill for the upcoming fiscal year, a bill that is supposed to ensure our local law enforcement, emergency responders, anti-terrorism experts, and border security professionals have the resources they need to keep our country safe. Instead, we saw a bipartisan and widely agreed upon bill that would fund Homeland Security efforts across the nation be overtaken by a violently controversial amendment from the gentleman from Iowa that was included in the final passage of the bill. The last-minute amendment goes beyond the pale of discrimination by prohibiting funding to implement President Obama's Deferred Action Plan from last year that will protect dreamers from deportation. This poison pill amendment endangers over 800,000 young, undocumented immigrants who have no home other than the U.S. and only want a fair shot at an education and an opportunity to pursue their passions out of the shadows. I voted against final passage of the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill because this amendment was allowed to be passed by the Republican majority, and I'm deeply saddened that over 220 of my colleagues shattered these young people's dreams.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it certainly is a privilege to be able to come to the floor and begin a dialogue, because there's one thing that I think is vital. We could hold up the Constitution, which I often do. We can speak with great eloquence on the floor of the House, even go to our districts and speak to our constituents. But I do think it is important that the trust of the American people, even though sometimes tattered or sometimes challenged, that what we can at least adhere to is that the values of this nation, the constitutional underpinnings of we all are created equal under the Declaration of Independence, and those vital 10 amendments that make up the Bill of Rights, among others, really go to the trust that the American people have in their government and in their documents that are the infrastructure of government. And when I say that, I am not in any way diminishing some very emotional debates that we've had over the years. We've engaged in debates on war and peace. We've engaged in debates on impeachment. Tragically, we've seen assassinations of our presidents. We've seen assassination attempts on our president. And so I know that the issue of trust or the issue of stability sometimes wobbles because it is human nature. We've seen the tragedy of 9/11, but yet Americans, by and large, with polls going up and down, will probably be more trustworthy than any other population of people. Why? Because they have a sense that even in the midst of vigorous disagreement between the partisans, between Republicans and Democrats and independents, that there's something that holds America together. And so I am rising today to try to be able to weave in and out why we must get back to that trust and why it serves us no purpose to go on an unsubstantiated witch hunt on what is one of the finest public servants that this country has seen, and that is the Attorney General of the United States, Eric H. Holder, Jr. Now, I will be discussing a number of items, because in the course of this discussion, I realize that some will agree and some will not. But minimally, what I would like to ensure is that we have a forthright and truthful discussion. That's really what is key. I base that upon being a battle-worn member of the House Judiciary Committee for any number of years. I have ascended to the position where you are called a senior member of the Judiciary Committee. And in the course of my work there, I have seen investigations that are far and wide. I lived through the horrific heinousness of 9/11 and having to craft something called the Patriot Act, which still needs to be challenged, and we need to err on the side of the rights of the American people. I have seen the investigation of the tragedy of Waco. Many people might not even remember that. The terrible loss of life. I've seen the throngs of pulling a child, a Cuban child, between families in Elian Gonzalez. I've seen the ups and downs of immigration and the debate about where we should go in immigration reform. I have seen the issues of impeachment and attempts on impeachment, trying to uphold civil rights, trying to write a Patriot Act, which came out of the Judiciary Committee right after 9/11 in our most vulnerable time, in a bipartisan way that balanced the rights of Americans alongside of the responsibilities that we had to secure America. So I have seen the fight for individual rights, and I'd like to think that when it comes to that challenge, that when you look at the record that I have offered, you have seen a record that prizes individual rights. So I do not believe that it is of any value, no matter what party you're in, to be in a cover-up. Cover-ups usually wind up with the covers being taken off. And so there's not really much advantage to a cover-up. But I want to discuss, away from the aura of cameras and hysteria, the work of a public servant that I've known for a number of years. Having come to this Congress a few years ago, I remember that General Holder not only worked for a Democratic presidents, but also worked for Republican president. In fact, George Bush II held Mr. Holder as his acting Attorney General or Deputy Attorney General, which is the highest ranking under the Attorney General. The view of him as an unbiased figure allowed him to be able to be, in essence, that bridge between administrations. He has served as a judge. He has been a prosecutor. He has likewise prosecuted those who would do Americans harm. He is a son, if you will, of those who struggled to overcome. And he had the honor of being appointed, named as President Clinton's Deputy Attorney General, the first African American to be so named. Pulled himself out by his bootstraps, having graduated from Columbia College, as he's so proud of, in New York. Attended the public schools, even schools that I'm familiar of. Some of my friends graduated from Stuyvesant High School, where earned something that was very much sought after in those times, a Regents Scholarship. Allowed him to attend Columbia College, majored in American history, and graduated from Columbia Law School. He is not one to accept your challenge of the affection he has for his college and his law school. He had a sense of desire to do good. And in those times, one of the premier civil rights law firms was the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. No, it is not the NAACP. This is a lawyers group that would defend you no matter who you were. In fact, I remember Constance Baker Motley out of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund defending the Klan in Alabama, because it is the motto and mission of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that if your rights are abridged, no matter who you are, we will stand up for those rights. And so he started there with a very refined sense of right and wrong and who should be defended. Wound up at the Department of Justice as what you call a line lawyer, criminal division. And then he joined, previously I guess, he joined the U.S. Department of Justice Attorney General's Honors Program. He was assigned to the Public Integrity Section, was tasked to investigate and prosecute official corruption, local, state, and federal levels. Some might say, when you saw Eric coming, you wanted to get out of the way. That was his sense of justice, balanced and fair, attacking those who were doing wrong to our system of justice and fairness, and yes, going after corruption in local, state, and federal government. Those were many years since 1976, and if I would take a guess, if he were going to falter in the practice of law or in the upholding of justice, he would have faltered a long time ago. Sorry, Mr. General, but you've been around for a long time. 1976 is a long time. In fact, I recall correctly, 1976 was in the midst of the administration between Carter, or just as Carter was coming in and after President Ford had served. So he has seen both Republican and Democratic administrations, and he has passed muster by his superiors. He's climbed up the ladder. He served in private business and private practice. He's not a new kid on the block. I had the chance to be with his wife, Dr. Sharon Malone, one of the premier physicians in this community, who has her own legacy, and the legacy of her sister, who was one of those who integrated the universities in Alabama during the segregated South. But the interesting thing about Eric is that he does not come with a sense of entitlement, which I don't like even using that word, because if you fix something that is broken, if you try to integrate because it is segregated, that is not entitlement. If you try to ensure someone has an opportunity, that is not negative when you say affirmatively you want to make sure that there is diversity. But Eric takes life as he sees it. And so it baffled me when we were proceeding through this process. And somebody said, bad things come in threes. I don't want to start that because I'm hoping we don't have any threes coming along. I've got to get on an airplane in a couple of minutes. But I would say to you that I would like to answer some of the questions. We've had, obviously, Benghazi falls in the State Department, but we've certainly had the misfortunes of the IRS. I want to clarify that IRS falls independently. The commissioners are appointed on a 6-year term so that they do not have the political influence of the presidential appointment, but their ultimate oversight is through the Secretary of the Treasury under the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and certainly that investigation is going forward at this time. But it seems like all of that was piling on someone who was not directly involved. Benghazi, IRS. But let's get to the one that has drawn the most ire, rightly so. And let me temper that, because I know that the IRS is drawing a great deal of ire. I've come to the floor and indicated that there are a lot of good, hardworking employees. Maybe you know some of them. Our colleagues see these people in our districts who are working every day to ensure that the American people who pay them, who own all of this in the United States government, are treated fairly. I know there are people like that, but certainly we are absolutely outraged of any prosecuting in a biased way for political beliefs. That is an absolute unpardonable sin, if you will, under the First Amendment. We've all agreed to that. We want a full investigation. And I can assure you, General Holder, if any parts of the Department of Justice are involved in a criminal investigation, if it is discovered we have an Inspector General under the IRS, you can be assured that the Department of Justice will be involved in determining whether any criminal activities have gone on as relates to the IRS. But what has drawn the most ire, and it should, is the precious press. The right to be told what is going on. Again, with a little bit of humor, I will tell you that those of us in the public eye really like that press story that says that we're cutting a ribbon for something that has been given from the federal government, or making the grand speech that someone will quote that was most erudite and astute. But the press should be unfettered, because it is the right of the American people to know what is going on in their government, no matter what level it is, from the school board to the county clerk to the state house to the city government and to your federal government. Maybe to the chagrin of many who are found out in the press, we understand. So when it is suggested that the Department of Justice would violate that sacred trust of blocking information to the American public, then obviously there is an enormous amount of concern. And I understand that. And I think it is enormously important to lay out this whole question of the Fox reporter, a gentleman who has been working on a number of projects, the whole idea of the release of the emails of the Associated Press, release of them or the targeting of them, targeting of one particular individual, Mr. Rosen of Fox News, and the May 15th hearing of which I was present in the House Judiciary Committee. I wanted to speak of what I know. One of the questions I raised was to just get a yes or no answer, is whether or not Mr. Holder had been a supporter of what we call the SHIELD Act in his professional career, a bill that had been supported by many of us in the last session or before, and that is to block or protect reporters and their proprietary information under the First Amendment. And for some reason, my good friends on the other side of the aisle, Republicans, did not see fit for that legislation to pass. So here we are, in a set of circumstances that speaks ill of anyone that would target a reporter, or this enormous leak of emails. All of this is being reviewed, but I want to focus on General Holder's frame and the very excellent Attorney General that he had in charge. He did not participate in the ultimate investigation and the determination for the ultimate subpoenas regarding the AP. It was done after some 15,000 pages of documents were issued, and they still could not determine how the leak, where the leak, or who would be the culprit of the leak. This is pertaining to issues that would have a detrimental impact on the security of the American people. So let me be very clear. It was not the reporters. It was to find out who was, for lack of a better term, the leaker. And yes, those are sources. That's the angst of the people, lawyers, entrusted with your protection in the Department of Justice. There is no doubt Congress has a right to restrain it in. For you elect us in the people's house to make sure that you are protected from that kind of intrusion. But let it be very clear that the intrusion was not to entrap reporters. It was to ensure us that we were protecting the American people. So all of a sudden, the general is in the hot seat. He recused himself from further investigation, and a number of questions were posed in that May 15th hearing. A number of the questions were posed. And one of the questions proposed were seeking a clarification about different laws, but asking the question about allowing for reporters to be prosecuted. And a paraphrasing but a fair handle on the answer of the general. In fact, if you can pay attention to newspaper accounts, precisely, if this is correct, with regard to the potential prosecution of the press for the disclosure of material that is not something I have ever been involved in, heard of, would think would be a wise policy. The active word is potential prosecution, prosecution. Yes, there was an FBI affidavit used to obtain the warrant for Rosen's emails, and there was probable cause, and this was in 2010, to determine whether any law had been broken. Yes, that was done. And the affidavit did describe this reporter, by way of reports, as an aider and abettor and or co-conspirator. But the Justice Department did not prosecute Mr. Rosen, did not even file charges against him. While he was listed as a co-conspirator, no charges were ever raised against him. No charges were pulled back. No acquittal, no prosecution. And so the answer of the Attorney General was accurate to the extent that anyone would suggest that he perjured himself is absolutely without context, without substance, without basis, without intent, without proof, and it serves no purpose. It serves no purpose. From all of that, and of course, some time back, a tragedy of Fast and Furious, and whenever I come to the floor, I offer my deepest sympathy for the lost and for the family who suffered an enormous loss of their great and wonderful son. There is nothing that one could say to bring back their son. And I have no quarrel with getting to the facts. But again, on Fast and Furious, none of it pointed back by independent arbiters. And this had to do with the misdirected, probably with good intentions, but misdirected and cruel results of putting guns in the hands of thieves and crooks to be able to track guns and gun trafficking between the United States and Mexico. I will not defend it. I am not here to defend that. I was appalled But I think we must have a reasonable discussion of truth. And the reasonable discussion of truth is, did Mr. Holder have anything to do with the mishaps of Fast and Furious? I can assure you that they have yet to point to him on that basis. Eric Holder came to the department and he took up the challenge, and these are words of his mission, that his challenge would be protecting the security, rights, and interests of the American people. More than 4 years later, together with the extraordinary men and women who serve at the Department of Justice, that promise has been fulfilled for many of the accomplishments that this department has achieved. Now, my good friend was on the floor, my good friend, and he is Mr. Smith of New Jersey. He has a passion for preventing, among other things, the prevention of human trafficking. We've worked together on these issues. Eric Holder has been a crusader to fight against the viciousness of human trafficking. He has, in fact, set up a task force in my own city of Houston, which, to our dismay, has been known as the epicenter of human trafficking. Young people, prostitution, individuals coming up through the southern border. One of the most debasing part of an existence is to be taken hostage, bondage, by someone else, to be abused and mistreated. And so he has been enormously committed, passionately committed to the idea of preventing human trafficking, and we look forward to working with him. He wanted to save you money, and they've had a very successful reach on financial fraud, setting up a consumer protection working group consisting of federal law enforcement regulatory agencies, making sure that those who attack the vulnerable with payday loans and the elderly know that the Justice Department is standing on their side. And the very ones that go after active duty military, how sad. Young people coming home from faraway places and all of a sudden they are victimized. The resources that they have that are limited. The lawsuit that was filed against mortgage fraud that took this country down, took homes away from those who deserve them. Billion-dollar lawsuit against Countrywide, led by this Department of Justice. Banking houses, various inappropriate behavior by some on Wall Street. General Holder was not afraid on behalf of the American people. And countless banking officers who took money, such as some of those whose names include Carollo and Goldberg and Grimm, all former executives of General Electric, were sentenced related to bidding for contracts for the investment of municipal bond proceeds and other municipal finance contracts, which would undermine not only the public trust, remember that's how I started, but it would also diminish the assets. It was this Justice Department that continued the prosecution of the Madoff brothers, Peter Madoff, on June 29, 2012, one of the most, oh my God, I'd use the word sad, but that is certainly not a strong enough word. But I did use the word tsunami, one of the most catastrophic attacks on people who innocently invested with someone who they thought would maximize their savings for the good old days of their sunset years. He continued to secure justice for victims of mortgage fraud. He worked on a number of issues regarding service members. And what I think was particularly important, what you wanted him to do, is he went after international cartels, domestic collusion conspiracies, price fixing, bid rigging, market and customer allocation. He was, along with his team, committed to serving the American people. I see my colleague is here, and I just want to mention a few others before I yield to her. Because, as I mentioned, his passion for people's lives are so moving that I need to get this on the record. The department has charged a record number of human trafficking cases. I gave you the story, but I didn't give you the facts. Over the past 4 years, the department has increased the number of human trafficking prosecutions by more than 30%. In forced labor and adult sex trafficking cases, while also getting a number of convictions in Innocence Lost National Initiative dealing with our children. And so the department has dismantled trafficking with Ukrainian victims held in Philadelphia in forced labor, Central American women, convicting the traffickers who threatened and violently abused them to compel them into forced labor and forced prostitution in restaurants and bars on Long Island. Or we restored the rights and freedom of the undocumented. I'd like to say we because this is close to my heart, of Eastern European victims, convicting the trafficker who brutally exploited them in massage parlors in Chicago, a Florida man, his wife, and co-defendant for actions involving sex trafficking of 7 minor victims in a house in Fort Lauderdale, and secured a life sentence against a gang member in Eastern District of Virginia for sex trafficking of victims as young as 12 years old. Eric Holder has not been sitting around trying to construct when he would come to Congress and perjure himself. That has not been his task and his challenge. Let me just say this, as there's a lot that I want to engage in. I'll just throw this out before I yield. Our violent crime rates have yielded, maybe because we see someone like the old movies about the FBI G-man. Maybe we see the H-man coming in Eric Holder, for he has prosecuted thousands of criminals with illegal gun possession. That does you harm. That does your children harm. And yes, I want to just say this to my distinguished colleague as I yield to Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. When the American people needed to have an unfettered voting system, yes, many disagreed. But Eric Holder and his team in the Civil Rights Division have not been overturned. They were following the law. We do expect a Supreme Court decision in a matter of days on Section 5. I cannot pretend what that decision will be. But there were a number of decisions that had to do with ensuring that there was one person, one vote. Remember, I started by saying, whether we agree or disagree, there should be something called trust. Many people would say to me, one person's trust is another person's poison. But it's all about the law. This Justice Department has been following the law. And it is crucial that when we use a litmus test to be able to determine whether someone should resign, and by the way, General Holder, do not resign. America needs a top law enforcement officer of integrity. Then the standard should be the law. The standard should be the Constitution. The standard should be the facts. The standard should be case law. And on Voting Rights Act and redistricting cases and election law, the majority of the cases, the infrastructure of the cases, have been upheld. They've been led by Eric Holder, the Attorney General of the United States of America. I would be, is the gentlelady desiring to join, and I'd be privileged to yield some time to the distinguished scholar, and she happens to be Congressperson of the great District of Columbia. Thank you for your leadership and scholarship on constitutional issues. Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Well, I thank the gentlelady first for yielding and for her kind words, but I thank her even more for what she's done this afternoon. She has come to the floor, my good friend from Texas, and has rendered one of the most informative, highlights of the career of this Attorney General since he has been Attorney General. I would like only a few minutes to say